So it's a cold morning, you go out to your car, and you see this. People are going to tell you, oh, just go ahead and replace the bulbs, no problem. So you do that, it kind of goes away, and then it comes back. Now, if you're having this intermittent issue and nothing seems to solve the problem, it's very possible that your Saab is having a complete meltdown. First off, this video is not for people who just have a bulb out and need to replace that. You can go ahead and do that, and if it works fine, it's fine. This is for people who have tried changing the bulbs and are still having this intermittent issue where they keep getting these errors that there's something wrong and that their bulbs need replacement. This video is specifically about a 2008 Saab 9.3 Turbo. Now, this problem definitely exists in other Saabs, and I'm sure there are other car manufacturers that have a similar problem. So you can take what you learn here and hopefully apply it to some other cars that maybe have a similar problem. Now, before we get to diagnosing the problem, let's talk about a little bit about what might have caused the problem. Now, what happens over time is that inside these little blocks that hold the bulbs, you can get oxidation between the bulb and the wires and between the contacts. This oxidation and corrosion from being exposed to the elements, especially in the trunk that's being opened and shut all the time, can cause these things to kind of get corroded and eventually start to melt down. And what that means is that you could actually have a wiring short or a bad connection caused by this type of oxidation. So step one to diagnose this problem is we need to take a look and see exactly how bad the problem might be. So what we need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and remove the bulbs and the bulb holding block from the car and take a look and see if we notice any damage. And I'll show you exactly where to look. So the first thing we're going to look at is for corrosion around the bulbs. This is a clear indicator that this area has been exposed to the elements. The second thing we're going to want to take a look at is this lighting block itself. And finally, the third thing we're going to want to take a look at is the wiring harness. Now, there are a couple parts you might want to get before you go ahead and start this whole process, because once you disconnect things, it's possible the problem could get worse. As you fiddle with the connections, it's possible that they will connect and disconnect, so we want to make sure that we have parts to replace them if something comes completely apart. So there's a couple of cheap parts you can get, and the first thing is a Saab wiring harness adapter, and these are pretty easy to get, and I will go ahead and I'll post links to where you can buy all these parts. I purchased them personally from Europarts, but they're not that hard to find. The second thing we're going to want to get is these locking tabs. Now, these are pretty small and easily lost, so I always like to buy a few extras. And the third thing is you need to buy these locking pins, and these are the pins that will crimp onto your wires and they'll replace any broken ones inside the wiring harness. Now, Saab has pretty specific ones, so you're going to want to make sure you buy the right type, and they're pretty cheap, so again, buy a few extras. There are also a few tools that you're going to need to do this process. The first is you're going to need a good crimper for the pins. And what these crimpers do is they allow you to connect these little contacts that go into the wiring harness and connect them directly to the bare wires. The second thing you're probably going to want is a tube of dielectric grease. Now, dielectric grease is a type of grease that can still conduct electricity, but what it does is when you apply it to contacts, especially contacts that are exposed to the elements, it will hopefully prevent this corrosion from happening in the future and prevent this fix from turning out the same way as the old one did. And finally, you'll need some of these, or many of these. These are pin extraction tools, and you're going to need those tools to remove the pins from this wiring harness connector. Now, it's hard to say exactly which one you're going to need. Luckily, you can buy a giant bag that works with almost any kind of harness and any kind of pin for almost no money. And again, I will link this down below in the description. Now, the final thing you might want to have on site is an extra block itself for the light bulbs. Now, this is not a super cheap part. This can run about 50, 60 bucks. So maybe you might want to hold off on this and wait to see if it's actually the problem. However, it is really easy to see if this block is the problem from the start. So why don't we start off there and I'll show you how to check this block out. So safety first, and whenever you're working with anything on a car, regardless of whether it's electrical or mechanical, it's always a good idea to disconnect the battery. So go ahead and do that before we get started. Once that's done, we can open the compartment on the side of the Saab, and we can use these two little push buttons to pop out the light bulb block, which will be still attached to its wiring harness and still have the bulbs inserted into it. Now, if we carefully remove the wiring harness from the light bulb holder using a screwdriver just to hold out the little locking pin on the side, we can take a quicker look and see what the contacts on the holder look like. So in my case, it definitely was a meltdown problem. Now, once I got the old block removed from the car, I was able to take a look in the back where the wiring harness plugged in, and I could see right away there was a problem. If you look closely here, and I know it's a little bit hard to see on the video, there should be 4 metallic pins in here, and there are only 3. So what happened on mine is I had literally a full meltdown. The contact on one of the wires had gotten so corroded and the connection was shorting out, so it actually melted or destroyed the metal contact. Now, the intermittent issue is probably because as this happened over time, it was making contact, stopped making contact, was making contact, and stopped again, so it would come and go. But eventually, it was destined for complete failure. Now, because that had melted, obviously, the next place to check is the wiring harness itself. And as you can see here, that wiring harness had damage to it as well. It shows burn marks, and if you look into this little hole right here, which was the one that connected to that metal prong, it looks like that prong had basically melted off the bulb holding block and fused into the wiring harness. So we're going to have to replace at least that one connection inside the wiring harness, and maybe more if we see more corrosion as we remove the pins. So right away, the first thing you'll notice as I'm examining this wire harness a little bit is that there is a burn mark on it and it's a little bit brittle. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop these pins out one by one and examine them. And right now it's probably a pretty good time to take a picture of the wires. So just in case anything falls out or you lose track of what wire you're on, you know where it goes back into the new harness. So I always find the easiest way to do this is to pop each pin out one by one and then insert it into the new harness bracket. That way, one wire out, one wire goes in, and you always have a reference. Now, getting the wires out can be a little bit of a pain in the neck. So before we can start removing the pins, we got to remove this little locking tab. And these are the small ones that I bought extras of. In theory, you can put this one right back in after you remove it on the new harness, but it's pretty easy to fall off and disappear. So once you get that tab removed, it's time to push the pins out of the connector. The way these little keys work is they look like little pitchforks, and what they do is when they slide in the front, they slide over the top of the inner pin. This pushes down those little spikes that hold it in place, and then as you continue to push, it's supposed to pop out the other side. Now, 2 of the pins work perfectly fine for me, but the middle 2 were a little bit more problematic because the connector had actually melted around them, which made it hard to release them, and eventually the connector just kind of cracked and fell apart into a few different pieces. So to get those out, I just used a metal pick and kind of carefully pried open the plastic around them until they released. Luckily, there was only one pin that actually took significant damage, and this is the one that fused to that metal tab that I showed that was inside the lighting bracket itself. Now we have to deal with repairing that one really messed up connection. And the way to do that is we're going to cut the old one off and we're going to put a new pin on it and then reinsert that pin into the harness. And that will complete that part of the repair. But getting the connector on the wire can be a little challenging, and that's because it's pretty tiny and a little difficult to use. So there's plenty of tutorials out there on how to put pins on wiring harnesses, but I'll just give you a few tips. The first thing you'll notice is that there's 2 parts of each pin. One part that goes over the actual insulation of the wire and the other part that makes contact with the bare wire itself. Using this example, I have a little piece of bare wire. What you can see is if I lay this down on the table, this back part over here, that goes over the insulation, and this front part will crimp down on top of the wire itself. Now, to hold this in place, I always find it easier just to take a pair of needle nose pliers and gently squeeze these back pieces till they make contact and grip pretty good with the insulation. This will make it so that the wire doesn't move as you actually go ahead and crimp it. Once that's done, you can just take your crimpers and you insert the wire based on how the instructions say, and you go ahead and you crimp these down. So with the broken part of the wire cut away and a new clean piece stripped off the end of it and a tip crimped on, we're able to insert this back into the wiring harness, and now we have a perfectly functioning wire harness again. So the last step is just to go ahead and put the bulbs back into the bulb holder and insert the connector back into that base. Now, before you do that, I like to do two things. One of which is to put a little bit of dielectric contact grease on each of the pins and also around the bulbs. Now, when you do this, you do need to be careful though, because dielectric grease, the reason it's called dielectric grease is it does conduct electricity. So if you let this touch between two contact points, it will cause a short. So the way I like to do this is just put a little tiny drop on the tip of each of the pins inside the bulb holder. So as I push the harness down, the grease will go into the harness contacts and it will not go across the contacts and short anything out. Now you also need to be careful with the bulbs because bulbs have two contact points as well. So you want to make sure you put some around the base and a little drop at the pin point on the end that makes the second contact. Now with all these processes done and the bulbs plugged back in and the connector connected back up, we can go ahead and snap this back into the taillight housing and close up the compartment door. And let's go ahead and see if it all worked. So there you go, the car started up, we have no more errors, the blinkers work, the taillights work, so I would say objective accomplished on this project. So hopefully this helps solve the problem for anyone else out there that might have had the same problem with the Saab and their taillights. I know this is kind of a common problem, so I know there's a bunch of you out there with this going on. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video useful in completing your Saab 9.3 taillight repair. If you liked this video and found it useful, go ahead and hit that like button down below. And if you want to see more content like this as soon as it comes out, make sure you go ahead and hit subscribe as well. So until next time, good luck on your project. And if you have any questions, as always, just leave a comment down below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible.